In a warm communal hut on the northern shore, two families set a table. Fish, cheese, wooden cups, handshakes, silence around the spoons. This is a peaceful wedding, a union of clans, where today they sign an agreement, but there will be no physical intimacy. The gifts have already been counted. The witnesses have been noted. But the most important part is not the feast or the bed. The most important part is the paper and the seal that decide what will happen tomorrow and where the line will be drawn between the will of the family and the will of adults. I welcome you. Please write in the comments where you are watching this episode from, which city or town. I wish you peaceful listening. Ahead is a story about how the North learned to measure consent, not by the voice of the crowd, but by the letter of the law. When the royal emissaries rode along the northern roads, they carried not only power, but also a new measure of marriage. The king, known as the lawgiver, for his work on revising the laws, compiled the scattered statutes into a single book for the kingdom. This codification made customary family transactions visible to the court. What an engagement was, where the boundaries of the dowry lay, who had the right to object, when it was permissible to postpone living together. The main change was that marriage was no longer the decision of the clan or the mere transfer of gifts, but the mutual will of the adult parties, recorded in a form recognized by the church and the royal court. This book was in effect for centuries and became a habit in itself, like a measuring peg at a barn. But the royal text did not hang in the air. Next to it stood the church text. Long before Northern unification, canonists formulated the principle that marriage makes the consent of those who are capable of it. Secret promises were condemned, but the will of the parties, expressed in the proper manner, was considered decisive. The minimum thresholds were linked to the age of maturity. For women, around 12 years old, and for men, around 14. Engagement as a promise of future marriage was allowed earlier, but living together was prescribed to be postponed until maturity. This dry set of rules was a weapon against family orders. If there was no consent, there was no marriage, no matter how many witnesses were gathered at the table. In practice, this looked like a long journey through rooms and books. First, the ting, or parish table. They recorded the intention, checked kinship and obligations, and wrote down the conditions of gifts and dowry. Then the intention was published, so that anyone could declare an obstacle. Finally, the church recorded the union, not a colorful performance, but a sequence of formalities, after which the parties were considered spouses by law, not by noise. And it was here that the northern judicial routine produced an unexpected result. The courts learned to temporarily separate the beds, recognizing the marriage itself as valid, but the life together as premature. If one of the parties claimed that the clan was rushing them and that physical intimacy should be postponed, the court applied the church doctrine that immature marriages should not become marital life until the age of maturity was reached. The public form saved them from domestic pressure better than shouting at the doorstep. In northern affairs, this was called by different names, but the essence was the same. Union as a legal fact, yes, shared bed, later. The record specified the terms, witnesses, obligations for maintenance and return of gifts, so that postponed intimacy would not become a reason for oppression. Economic details were also included: the size of the mourning gift, the order of disposal of part of the property by the party insisting on the postponement, and the family's responsibility for attempts to force a change in the decision. Thus, a peaceful wedding turned into an agreement without drama or humiliation. Adults were given time, and the court remained an observer, ready to intervene if the family began to exert pressure. The structure was based not on fine words, but on two pillars. The royal code of rules defined jurisdiction and form, while the church procedure defined the limits of coercion, where consent could be confirmed and intimacy postponed without shame. The conflict with custom continued. It could not be abolished with a single stroke of the pen. At the Tingas, the elders still spoke of the honor of the clan and the benefits of the union. But now, the adult parties had a new path: a written objection, followed by a formality check, and then temporary protection from clan discipline. The minutes recorded. The will was confirmed. Cohabitation was postponed until maturity. Property was inventoried. Family interference was limited, and attempts at violence were classified as criminal cases rather than upbringing. At this point, the myth that marriage is an act of clan came up against the paper that marriage is the result of the consent of individuals, not a gathering. The North did not suddenly become softer. It simply received a tool with which clan pressure ceased to be the only option. This is the essence of lawmaking: to provide a procedure through which adults can call their will marriage, not a bargaining chip. If we continue, the next part will go deeper. How exactly the court postponed marital intimacy, what records the parish kept, how gifts were counted, how attempts to circumvent the postponement were punished, and how the royal book interacted with the law of neighboring lands. Further on, everything became even more dry and therefore more effective. Marriage ceased to be a scene, turning into a sequence of steps that were difficult to deceive with loud family names. First, the community table recorded the promise, not as a final result, but as an intention with a list of conditions: who brings gifts, where the chest with the keys is kept, who gets the morning gift, who is responsible for daily maintenance if living together is postponed. Then the parish announced the intention, so that every adult could declare an obstacle: forbidden kinship, unresolved debt disputes, previous vows, violence, hidden illness. It was not a performance, it was the air that ventilated the room before people moved in. Only after that did the document move to the church book, where the marriage became a form recognized by the court, not the crowd. In the same bundles, the paper allowed the movement to the bed to be stopped if one of the parties declared pressure from the family or fear of premature intimacy. The court did not destroy the union. It put up a barrier inside the house, set a term, appointed witnesses, and listed maintenance obligations, so that the postponed bed would not turn into punishment. The royal codification acted like a dry craftsman. It removed unnecessary gestures and secured the instrument. Stereotypical lines appeared in urban and rural records. The will of the parties is recognized. No obstacles have been identified. Joint life is postponed until maturity is reached. Property is described. The chest with the keys is left with the party insisting on the postponement. Any attempt at coercion is punishable in a secular court. Violation of church form is punishable by penance. Next came the accounting. How much it costs to maintain a house without a bed, who pays the witnesses, who keeps the seals, who has the right to present the inventory to the court. Such an order sounds heartless until you understand the main thing. Without these lines, both parties have no breath, only cries, their own and those of others. Here, the procedure takes away their breath. The northern courts knew how to look at the union not only through the eyes of the clan. The notebooks contained cases where joint life was postponed in favor of an adult woman who referred to pressure and suffering, and cases where the same protection was given to an adult man whom the family used as a political tool. The very possibility that consent lay with the two individuals and not with the courtroom witnesses broke the old music of the clan pavane. The courts also noticed the economics of this music. If the union was concluded for the sake of peace between the courts, then the postponement of intimacy required the protection of the dowry, so that the clan would not punish silent stubbornness with hunger and cold. The decisions contained dry orders. Leave the chest. Do not touch the keys. Do not evict. Pay for fire and bread. Keep clothes and bedding intact. Compensate for losses if the family tried to initiate behavior correction under the guise of care. Then there was a prepared twist, in which the royal book relied on the church principle. Marriage is held together by will, not violence, and any attempt to make a life together by force turns a marital dispute into a criminal case. The North knew the word abduction not as something romantic, but as a serious offense. The capture of an adult against their will was punishable by imprisonment and fines, and if the action was accompanied by threats or harm, the punishment was increased. The court, which postponed the bed in order to protect the will, simultaneously warned, any independent transfer of the bed into the house without the procedure would be interpreted as a crime, not as family persistence. It sounded harsh, but there was no other way. The line between postponement and abuse is thin, and it is maintained not by good intentions, but by a seal and a key. Another twist concerned the myth that the North tolerates secret rites if everyone is happy with the outcome. The documents saw it differently. A secret wedding, without publication of intent, without checking for impediments, and without witnesses, was not considered a marriage, even if the participants were adults, and even if they thought it was more honest before God. Such a union was easily broken, and its participants were brought back to the procedure. Silence was not considered a virtue. Silence was considered a weak point for violence. publication of intent was a shield, not a humiliation. Anything that could be objected to had to be said before the house became a marriage home. On this point, the church book and the royal text stood shoulder to shoulder. Form is more important than romance because form protects the weak. The third twist came when the family tried to maintain control through gifts. Gift arrays, from chests to cow stalls, were an important part of unions, and the clan wanted to dispose of them if cohabitation did not occur in a timely manner. The courts cut this knot calmly. Gifts given in connection with a promise of marriage remained with the party that did not violate the form. An attempt to take them away under the guise of punishment for indecision was classified as arbitrariness, with a refund of the cost and additional penalties. The economics of the union thus ceased to be a club and turned into a sum of obligations verifiable on paper. The cold-bloodedness of this accounting was more frightening than any threatening speech. It deprived the clan of the opportunity to exert pressure through need. The convergence of northern unification with church procedure gave rise to another harsh detail: the right to live separately while remaining married. In some cases, the courts confirmed the union. But until one of the parties reached maturity, they prescribed living under the same roof but without a bed. Joint expenses were counted, the house was protected from intrusions, visits from relatives were limited, and any attempts to arrange an affair were interpreted as a violation of the court order. It was a boring and difficult life, but it was better than a quick outcome imposed by the clan. In some cases, health checkups with a trusted doctor were scheduled, not to intrude into the home, but to leave an indisputable record for the court. There was no coercion. The bed was untouched, the household was fed, and the property was intact. The authorities did not idealize people. They calculated. If the clan tried to circumvent the postponement with eloquence, the parish demanded a repeat declaration of intent. If the clan tried to circumvent the postponement by force, the royal representative transferred the dispute to the secular sphere and imposed punishment for violence. These mechanisms worked because the royal book wove into the fabric of everyday life, not slogans, but roles. Who writes, who checks, who keeps the keys, who is responsible for fire and bread, who compensates if harm does occur. The most frightening thing about this scheme was not the punishment, but its predictability. The clan knew in advance that the path of the knife would lead not to reasoning, but to an entry in the register and to punishment, and that the path of pressure through poverty would lead to the same entry. The North loved to talk about honor, but it was paper that valued it more. In cases where postponed intimacy turned into a long pause, the courts protected the reputation of both parties with a record. The union is recognized, the bed is closed, slander is prohibited, and spreading rumors about inferiority is punishable. In this passage, the word consent took on another layer of meaning. It was not only the will to union, but also the will to the pace of that union. Adults were given the right not only to say yes, but also to say later without the risk of being crucified in the marketplace of gossip and family reprisals. And all this because royal codification made it possible to legally place a wooden barrier between the home and the crowd. When the old statutes of neighboring lands came into play, the northern procedure did not pretend that the world ended at the border. If a union was formed between families from different legal zones, the parish and the court checked the compatibility of the forms and demanded that the procedure be brought to a common denominator. Publication of intent, according to our customs, verification of impediments, according to our lists, prohibition of cohabitation until maturity, according to our rules. No, this is not pride or strength. It is a habit of protecting adults equally as long as they enter through the same door. In such matters, clan politics particularly liked to tell tales about how foreign laws would never understand northern honor. The document responded with numbers. How many disputes had been settled? How many homes had avoided violence? How many cases had brought compensation without shame? The tales lost out to the numbers. There is a dark side to this routine, which is dryly recorded in the chronicles. Sometimes a postponement did not save people from rough intervention. Sometimes the clan tried to break into the house and correct the order in their own way. Sometimes an adult was taken out of protection and returned to the clan hut, where the threat was hidden behind words about duty. These cases did not end up on the church page, but in the secular list of punishments. They were recorded without details: what was done, by whom and when, what punishment was imposed, what damage was compensated. The courts had to save face when the clan demanded leniency for the sake of peace, and the injured party was afraid to make a fuss. At such moments, the royal procedure revealed its most terrible feature: indifference to fine words. It looked at the seal, the key, the chest, the publication record, the line about the postponement. If all this was in place, then any arbitrary peace turned into punishable arbitrariness. On the other hand, not every postponement was eternal. The notebooks contained entries stating that upon reaching maturity, the parties confirmed their desire to live together through a church procedure, not a celebration, but again, a list of steps. The court recorded the date, the parish made a note, the witnesses signed, the chest was recounted, the morning gift was confirmed, and the house moved from a state of anticipation to a normal family routine. Such an outcome did not become a legend. It passed by the chroniclers because there was no blood or scandal involved. But it was precisely these silent denouements that created another northern myth, not about brute force, but about the heavy discipline of form, which can withstand both fear and the pride of the clan. Behind this discipline stood the king, whose nickname was forever attached to the laws, and the church scribes, accustomed to measuring passions by the page. Their alliance did not eliminate poverty, cold, disease, and harsh winters, but it took away the right of those winters to dictate how quickly and how exactly adults should share their beds. The most frightening thing in this story is not punishment or prohibitions. The most frightening thing is the detail with which the record can unclench someone else's fingers from someone else's throat. There is no mercy in it, but there is a limit. And when two families set the table again in another communal hut, the most important thing in the room is not the cups or the gifts. The most important thing is the book in which the will for union and the will for postponement can be recorded, so that even strong people are forced to live alongside this will and not above it. The northern custom of deciding fates at a long table by the hearth breathed heat, but the law learned to cool the heat with an iron strip of procedure. Where the clan considered marriage part of its domain, the text placed the union within the boundaries of jurisdiction. What was subject to ecclesiastical review? What was heard by the royal representative? What steps could not be taken at the family council? At the heart of this fork in the road was an agreement on the boundaries of power, ecclesiastical and secular, which established that matters of marriage, the form of its conclusion, and obstacles to it were subject to ecclesiastical jurisdiction, while coercion and violence, even if covered up by talk of peace between courts, were subject to secular courts. This was not a compromise for the sake of beauty. It was a balance in which neither the clan nor the parish could, with a single gesture, change the life of an adult. Church doctrine gave the court the coldest tool at its disposal: age thresholds for consent and the rule of maturity. For many years, canonists repeated the same formula. A union arises from the will of adults. For a girl, the threshold of maturity was considered to be around 12 years of age, and for a young man, around 14. A promise of future marriage could be recorded before these thresholds, but living together was postponed until maturity. In case of doubt, the court had the right to separate the beds, preserving the union as a legal form. It sounded dry, but it was precisely this dryness that provided shelter from the outcry. The paper allowed adults to say later and get protection for that later, rather than a new form of humiliation. Royal codification picked up on this logic and made it visible as a ritual of craft. First, a declaration of intent, so that any adult could declare an obstacle. Then verification of kinship and debt ties. Then the recording of gifts and property, so that the family's savings would not become a noose around their necks. Then the church registration of the union, and, if requested by one of the parties, a decree postponing cohabitation until maturity, with obligations for maintenance and a list of sealed items. There was nothing spectacular about this latter. It was a memory of steps. The law itself, compiled under the king, glorified as a lawmaker, held the country together for centuries, and thus transformed disparate customs into a single path that could be followed without leaving blood on the threshold. In the notebooks of northern parishes and tinges, it looked like a long accounting of human will. The adult side, which insisted on a postponement, remained under the roof, but without a bed. The chest with the keys was under inventory and seal. Fire and bread were at a predetermined cost. family visits, by the hour, and in the presence of witnesses. Attempts at quick correction through noise and force were transferred to the secular category, with penalties in favor of the injured party. There was no heroism in these cases. There was a sequence in which each step stopped the clan inertia that divided people into loyal and stubborn. And it was precisely this sequence that forced the strong to choose caution. The road to the knife led to punishable arbitrariness. The road to poverty, to the return of gifts and a fine for attempting to pressure through hunger. The myth of the northern secret wedding, which was supposedly respected for the sake of peace, collapsed on the eve of publication. Without declared intentions, without checking for obstacles, and without form, the church did not recognize the marriage, and the royal side did not accept family silence as an argument. Silence was considered not a virtue, but a condition for abuse. A life together, begun quietly with a previously appointed delay, was interpreted as a violation of order, with punishment for those who arranged it. Thus, the document took away from the clan its favorite decoration, a quick union created by whispering, and replaced it with a stand with seals and dates, where whispering turns into a line and ceases to control bodies. The economic layer became particularly noticeable. Gifts, from chests to rights to part of the herd, lost their role as a weapon. If cohabitation was postponed formally, the gift of the party that did not violate the order was protected. An attempt to take away the gift for slowness became arbitrariness with a refund of the cost and additional penalties. The size of the mourning gift was recorded separately so that it would not be lost in the family budget and become a lever of coercion. The court did not argue about love. The court counted barrels, candles, and bread. And it was this arithmetic that cut off the old ways of pressure faster than any rhetoric. Where the union affected different legal zones, sea islands, border parishes, the Northerners already had a remedy for disputes over foreign customs, to bring the form to a common denominator. Proclamation. According to our order, obstacles. According to our list, postponement of the bed. According to our lines. There was no pride in this. It was a habit to protect adults equally if they entered a house on our land. In these matters, there were often tales that foreign laws would not understand our honor. But in the end, the tales lost out. Less violence, fewer quarrels at the gate, fewer confiscations under the guise of instruction. The king's book worked like a quiet dam, smoothing out the muddy flow. Sometimes the boards in this dam would crack. There were cases where a postponement did not save a person from a brutal invasion by their clan, where an adult was pulled out from under protection under the pretext of quick reconciliation, where threats were hidden in prayers for obedience. These episodes ended with secular punishments and dry lines. Who interfered? What they threatened? What was compensated? No scenes, only seals. The authorities maintained an indifferent tone, which was more frightening than thunder. Indifference does not mean apathy. It means that the beauty of speech will not change the outcome if there is a publication, an inventory, and a postponement order on the table. Where the clan swore peace, the document reminded them that peace meant signing off on expenses for firewood and bread and an unopened chest, not a stranger's hand pulling them to bed. And conversely, not every postponement turned into an eternal pause. In the same books, there were short entries where, upon reaching maturity, the parties confirmed their desire to live together. The date, witnesses, re-examination of obstacles, recounting of the chest, confirmation of the morning gift. The house quietly changed its regime. The church indicated that the union was now complete, and the secular side closed the previous security. No legends, just life, in which form pulled people through a difficult period and did not break. These endings rarely made it into later retellings because there is no drama in them. But it was precisely these that showed why, in the North, law-making proved stronger than clan songs. Because songs have no date and no seal, while form does. Behind all this was the long shadow of the royal book, a code that had lived through the centuries and brought back the power over marriage to a framework where the will of adults was more important than clan interests. The North remained harsh. Poverty, winters, and disease did not ask for permission. But how and when adults turned their union into a shared bed ceased to be a scene for the clan. Consent and legal form took priority over the dance of gifts and handshakes. This was the strange northern humanism, without words about humanism. Respect for the wooden ruler, for the date, for the seal, and for the right of an adult to say yes and later, so that no one dared to switch these words around. And when the next feast began with the same whisper about peace, the most important item on the table was again a book, not for prayers, but for life. Within this system, land accounting was particularly important. In the North, a house rarely stood apart from fields, pastures, and forest rights. The clan believed that a union was a way to get their hands on someone else's land. The royal book broke this logic with an everyday technique. As long as communal life is postponed, the disposal of communal land and movable property is locked away by a responsible adult from among the witnesses, and transactions concluded in the name of family benefit are subject to cancellation if they are found to exert pressure on the party that obtained the postponement. This was followed by a dry list. Who is allowed to feed the livestock? Who records the proceeds from the sale of fish and cheese? Who is obliged to reimburse the costs for the winter if the clan tried to reason with stubbornness through hunger? Where elders had previously flaunted their power over the grain bag, a quiet notebook with signatures and dates appeared, and grain ceased to be a belt, turning back into food. This same notebook also protected the word consent from becoming an empty sound. If an adult insisted that the will had been extracted under duress, the court was not satisfied with general statements of honor. The court looked for 6 simple things: publication of intentions, verification of obstacles, recording of the form, a note about the postponement, an inventory of the chest, and a list of witnesses. In the absence of any of these links, the family lost the right to refer to everything has already been decided, and the union was not considered complete until the form was corrected. No loud restoration of honor was envisaged, only a seal and a repeat of the steps. It was not this that offended the clan's memory, but the inevitability. The order was the same for the rich and the poor, for the fisherman's yard and the yard by the road, and therefore the old names no longer opened doors without knocking. Closer to the sea, where alliances were cemented by transportation and shares in ships, the dispute moved to another level, whose signature has the decisive power on the commodity books, if the bet is closed until maturity. Here, the royal side preferred a complex but honest solution: joint economic management without mixing bodies. Until the age was reached, the party that had obtained the deferral continued to dispose of its movable property and part of its income, and large transactions required a double signature and a witness's mark. An extra step at the pier removed the old trick when the clan declared a merchant agreement as proof of a normal family life. Now, evidence was replaced by a voice. There were 2 signatures on paper and a decree on separate beds on the doors, and any attempt to play against this bond resulted in secular punishment. What looked like a chain of trifles actually saved adults from the very family pedagogy about which gentle legends were later composed. The legends suggested that a harsh land required harsh measures. The notebooks suggested that harshness usually covered up the hunt for a dowry. The court did not argue with the harsh Winters, but it took away Winter's right to be an ally of violence. If a clan expelled an adult from their home for being unyielding, the parish took the expelled person under its protection, assigned them maintenance from specified sources, and considered this not charity, but the fulfillment of its duty. Violence became an expense rather than an argument. This accounting was the most tangible morality, even though no words about morality were spoken. Long-distance marriages, where family interests intersected with neighboring laws, were particularly acute. Words about our honor usually rolled across the table along with the barrels. But the procedure remained straightforward: announcement of intentions in the parish where the house was located, verification of obstacles according to the list of the land where the union would live, registration of the form according to church custom, postponement according to the royal book, if requested by one of the parties. Objections about foreign customs were quelled in the same way as domestic quarrels, with a seal and signatures. Adults were given back the right not to be transported across the strait like cargo. In rare cases, the dispute reached mutual refusal, and then the paper put an even drier end to it. Return the gifts that had been exchanged, reimburse the witnesses' expenses, and close the book as a failed union. Legends called such cases shameful. Records called them formally exhausted, and it was far more honest than dragging two people through life for the benefit of the court. The North made no secret of the fact that the church held the key to formality. An entry in the church book made the union a marriage in the legal sense, and it was this entry that allowed the secular side to intervene when a clan tried to circumvent the postponement with cries or cunning. For the same reason, silence was dangerous. Secret promises, made without publishing intentions and without checking for obstacles, did not provide protection. They brought vulnerability. As soon as one of the parties declared pressure, such a right collapsed, for it was originally made in a place where abuse was easier to live with, in the shadows. Justice here looked not like a grand idea, but like a lamp in the hallway. Turned on, it meant faces, seals, and dates were visible. Turned off, it meant it was convenient to push people through the threshold. There were always stories circulating around the lamp that the clan and the parish were still able to come to an agreement without a trial, for the sake of peace. Sometimes this was the case, and then everything looked decent: an announcement, a check, a record, a postponement, maintenance, witnesses on site. But, more often than not, the word peace hid fatigue that they tried to solve with someone else's bed. That is why the Northern letters stubbornly upheld the ban on cutting corners. It was impossible to quickly fix a union in the middle of the night and consider the case won. It was impossible to bring to the parish a sign of consent obtained through persuasion or threats. Everything obtained in this way became meaningless on the judge's table. Only in this way did the procedure remain stronger than rhetoric, and adults stronger than their own fears. Inheritance was always linked to marriage, and here too, different voices were heard. The family believed that as long as the bed was not opened, the right of blood could be interpreted more freely, and the gift could be revoked or redistributed. The court responded sharply, but predictably. If the union was recognized and postponed in form, an attempt to rely on the incompleteness of the marriage to redistribute the inheritance was equated with abuse, and the injured party was entitled to compensation. This was not generosity, it was protection of a path that cannot be taken if at every step you are beaten with the long stick of custom. In those rare cases, when the parties parted ways after reaching maturity without starting a life together, the same records helped to close the account without a fight. Returns confirmed by witnesses, corrected inventories, seals removed. Over time, another detail emerged in these cases, one that was rarely mentioned in the chronicles but meant a lot in the kitchens. People learned to say the simple, heavy word, later aloud, without fear. Not because the hearts of Northerners had softened, but because behind this word there was suddenly an infrastructure, a parish where intentions are read, a court that determines maintenance, witnesses who are not ashamed to sign a paper, and a home that will not be broken into for correction. This later ceased to be personal audacity and became a legal formula. And like any formula, it calmed hot heads better than sermons. Canonists, of course, did not write about northern weather. They wrote about will and maturity. The royal side did not write about beauty. It wrote about signatures and the cost of firewood. Together, these texts formed a defense that cut off the ancestral pressure at the very border where people used to be broken, between home and bed. Deferred intimacy turned out to be not shameful, but a way to avoid humiliating oneself and breaking another. The compromise was simple. First the legal form, then the legal bodies. Everything else was arbitrariness with predictable consequences. The most frightening scene took place when the paper arrived at the house after the breakup. There were cases where the clan still exerted pressure, where an adult was forcibly dragged to someone else's bed, where neighboring men, adults and strong, believed they were helping honor. The notebook recorded such incidents briefly: names, date, place, harm, punishment, compensation. And in these short lines there were no lofty ideas about justice, but an icy certainty that form is stronger than the pack if form has guardians. In the North, the word law was rarely spoken with warmth, but it was precisely the coldness of the records that sometimes gave people back the ability to breathe. This opportunity did not make unions happier. It made them more honest. Where two households fell apart because later turned into never, the court did not try to restore love. The court closed the books and allowed life to go on without eternal shame. Where later became now, the church and the parish quietly filled in the empty lines, and the house returned to normal, as if there had been no storms. In both cases, the helmsman remained the same: the consent of adults and legal form. And every time a new feast began with talk of profit, the most important item, if not the most beautiful, was placed on the table. The very sheet of paper on which one could write one's will in letters, so that even powerful relatives could not rearrange those letters. In the records of parishes and tinges, another layer gradually emerged: the labor regulations of consent. The parties whose joint life had been postponed by the court lived in a shared house without a bed, separate chests under seal, a shared hearth on account, family visits by the hour, and in the presence of witnesses, income recorded in a notebook, large transactions, only with a double signature. For the clans, this seemed like a humiliation of their usual authority. But for adults, it became a way to live out their yes without pain and shouting. The parish recorded not emotions, but objects. How many candles were allowed per month? Who delivered the flour? Who had the key to the chest? Which scroll was kept by the guard so that it could be requested at any moment? If the clan tried to speed up events by pressuring with hunger or cold, the papers would revoke the property and impose a penalty, and the inventory of items would be supplemented with a new line to compensate for what was lost. Thus, the myth that harsh land requires harsh measures was shattered every time by the bill for firewood, bread, wool, and candle wax. The most difficult cases arose where the clan did not believe that paper was stronger than the night. There were attempts to move the bed into the house without a court decision, under the guise of quick reconciliation, where an adult was caught in a vice of persuasion and threats. These episodes did not turn into detailed stories. They were recorded as dry crimes against the will. Who did it? When? Where? What punishment? And what compensation were imposed? The royal side maintained an indifferent tone, and thus did the most terrible thing. It deprived the scene of its appeal. Secret coercion ceased to be a matter of honor. It became an expense with specified amounts and deadlines. The arrival and the ting, in conjunction with codification, deprived the clan of its main tool, speed. When speed ceased to be an advantage, clan politics had to learn to wait for maturity, along with those it was accustomed to calling its own. The church form stood in this mechanism like a lamp at the door. Public announcement of intentions, verification of obstacles, entry in the book, and, if requested by one of the parties, a decision on postponement, turned the dark room into a space where it was difficult to drag a person away without noise. For centuries, stories circulated in northern households about secret rites, supposedly respected for the sake of peace. But the document saw things differently. Without an announcement, without verification, without a book, there is no marriage, only vulnerability. The louder the word peace was uttered, the more closely the court checked to see if it was hiding an attempt to circumvent the formula of consent. Here, the book and the parish spoke with one voice. Form is more important than legend, because form protects the weak in the coldest hour. The economy was ahead of moralizing in another way as well. Gifts, which the clan loved to use as leverage, were losing their impact. The mourning gift was secured separately, with a clause for deferral, so that it would not disappear in the general estimate and become a reason to return people to bed for the sake of justice. On the coast, where marriages were bound by shares in ships and warehouse receipts, an even more subtle protection was included: joint economic registration without physical intimacy. Until maturity was reached, the parties conducted business as partners in property, not as spouses in bed. Any attempt to turn a merchant's signature into proof of a normal family life fell apart with the ruling on separate beds. At the pier, it looked not romantic, but boring. 2 signatures, witnesses, a note about the ruling, a seal. That's why it worked. When unions crossed legal boundaries, the common denominator regime kicked in. Intentions were announced at the place of future residence. Obstacles were checked against the list of that land. The form was recorded according to church statutes, and postponements were recorded according to the royal book. Different legal traditions argued for centuries, but in matters of consent, the North held its line. Foreign customs should not cast a shadow over the home, where it is most convenient to keep a person by the throat. This line was not about pride, but about predictability. Clan legends like to convince people that they understand honor differently there. The paper responded with numbers. Where the procedure was carried out to the end, there was less violence, less arbitrariness, and fewer destroyed homes. This mechanism also had its reverse effects. Not every postponement became a bridge to a life together. The records contained cases where, upon reaching maturity, the parties did not confirm their will. Then the court closed the union without drama, the return of gifts according to lists, reimbursement of witnesses' expenses, removal of seals, release of the house, a mark exhausted in form. This outcome was considered cold, but it was precisely what saved people from a long, humiliating burnout in the bedroom, where they were drawn out of politeness to the peace between the courtyards. Northern humanism did not admire itself. It allowed for an honest breakup, so that no did not sound like a crime. At the other end of the scale were cases where later became now, just as quietly. The parish entered the date, the court removed the security, the witnesses signed, and the house returned to normal. These records did not become songs, but they held the air that adults breathe. The most stubborn resistance came not from songs, but from storerooms. Not every family was willing to leave a chest and keys with someone who had obtained a postponement. Attempts to bring order through the household were quickly suppressed. The unauthorized transfer of items was interpreted as arbitrariness. If the items managed to disappear, the court ordered the return of their value and went further, more strictly, to prohibit access. Sometimes a guard was appointed from the parish, not over people, but over the door, just so that the seal would not be broken at night. These decisions seemed humiliating to the powerful, but they were the only guarantee that the paper would remain on the table until morning. Thus, the law learned to work like a carpenter, to put a crossbar where the opening breaks. A separate issue was the junction of consent with inheritance. Families tried to play on the incompleteness of the marriage. If there is no bed, then it is possible to simplify the bloodlines and redistribute future shares. The court cut off this path, equating such maneuvers with abuse of procedure. If the union is recognized and postponed in form, incompleteness does not give the right to redistribute. Otherwise, the postponement would be reduced to an empty word. The response was dry and predictable. Compensation to the injured party, return of the illegally redistributed property, and an entry in the book of violations. The severity of this dryness was the main support, when the word later became a right, not a reason to hunt. The canonists in their collections did not know the northern black waters, did not listen to the winter winds, but their formulas held the house together better than beams. They gave the court the right to separate beds until maturity, and to consider this not a disgrace, but a protection of the will. Royal codification hid these formulas in the routine of everyday life: parishes, inventories, seals, witnesses, guards. Together, they created a strange type of power, the power of predictability. Adults could say yes and later with equal confidence because both words were backed by the same technique. A lamp by the door, a book on the table, a seal on the chest, a key in the right hand. This technique had its weaknesses. Sometimes witnesses turned out to be related. Sometimes guards were given gifts. Sometimes the parish lost sheets. The royal side responded not with anger, but with repairs, replacing witnesses from neighboring courtyards, prohibiting the acceptance of gifts, duplicating records, and adding additional lists. The bad news was that abuses never disappeared. The good news was that abuses did not have a monopoly on speed. Routine caught up with them. This was the clan's main defeat. It lost the right to decide where everything still seemed to be its stage. In the long run, it was routine that left a deeper mark than any victory. The language of the houses became formulas. Within the form, announced and verified, the bed is closed until maturity. The key is in such and such's hands. The chest is under such and such's seal. These expressions replaced the usual threats and hints. They did not make life warmer, but they made it more honest. And when, years later, another feast began to buzz with talk of profit and peace, it was not a cup or a knife that found itself at the center of the table, but a book. Not an icon or a song, but a sheet of paper on which one could write one's will in such a way that neither cold, poverty, nor family authority could rearrange the letters. This is how the Northern Compromise was formed, without fancy titles. The consent of adults came before clan pride. The legal form came before haste and whispers. A postponed bed came before legends of peace at any price. And there was more dignity in this sequence than in 1,000 speeches. Because dignity is not a loud word about honor, but a key that remains with the one who said later, and a seal that cannot be broken at night.